Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, in this video, I want to talk again about what we mean when we talk about the NPD as lacking empathy. Okay, but I want to see it more in a broader sense that we're lacking an integration with our environment. Okay, not just the empathy. The empathy is just one part of it. Okay, so in other words, I'm trying to focus on kind of looking beyond just the interpersonal aspect. Okay, if we look at how we face our environment, okay, the interpersonal is just part of our environmental content. Okay, so basically what I think is happening with NPD is that through our, let's just say through our through our activation in life, the way we get activated, I think we activate modalities, okay, that have a way of sort of closing the ventilators, sort of like the ventilation to the outside. And I think that's when you start to distinguish the ego from the environment. Okay, so when the ventilation is open, you don't have a distinction between the self and the environment. You're sort of integrated into the environment, but that in certain activated modalities, we sort of close the ventilation, we sort of close the windows, and then the air inside the house doesn't mix with the air outside the house, and the air outside the house doesn't come into the house. So basically, obviously, I think every single activated modality that we have is an inherited, not just from our family, but also just human. It's part of the human endowment. Okay, this is just the human endowment. It's not particular to specific families, although in some families it may be more expressed, but we have certain modalities. And I think of these modalities as kind of like operators, kind of like how we operate and deal with the world. Okay, so obviously we're going to have some modalities in the human endowment that are more militant, that are more competitive, that are more kind of ruthless operators. Okay, these are things that are inherited through the endowment of humanity. This is thousands of years of this is just part of our. I would just say these are the characters that are inherited in us. Okay, just like when you look at an actor, you can recognize when they're getting angry. You can recognize when they're being the tough guy. You can recognize when somebody's being like the gang leader, or the bad guy or the trickster. These are all like almost like archetypes. And I don't want to use the word archetype. I just think they're just types. They're just modalities. These are just part of our kind of like the alphabet of our behavior and our operation in the world. So we're sort of born with a kind of like alphabet. We're sort of like a menu. We're sort of born with a menu of possible operators, or like modalities. Okay, so I think what happens is that in NPD, we have overexpressed, or we too easily fall into certain kind of operating modalities in the face of stress, in the face of a life that has challenges and, whatever. And so as we are activated in life, maybe as early childhood, but, adolescence, whatever, we get, there are certain things in us, in our own alphabet, in our own menu that we're born with that, for example, like I have like certain kind of very almost militant operators. Okay, so there's operators in me that have a very purposeful, kind of ruthless, military almost operation. Okay, and this is how I deal with my life stress. If I feel overwhelmed, sometimes I just freeze. That's another operator I have, is just the frozen, just freeze. But also sometimes I'm like, okay, damn it, I'm just going to plow through all this crap. And then there's my purposeful operator, and the purposeful operator is kind of militant, it's kind of directed, and it sort of closes the windows and forces ahead, you know? And so as we close the windows to ventilating with the environment, we start to develop the enclosure of the ego. Okay. And so basically, to sort of mitigate that ego process, we want to look at ways that we can sort of open the windows, but we also have to understand that certain of these activated operators, okay, in us, these modalities, they sort of want to close the windows, and it's instinctive. For example, when you see dogs getting angry, it's instinctive that the hair goes up in their back. Okay. It's also instinctive when you see some animals that their ears go back. The ears go back. These are absolutely instinctive limbic transformations. Okay. As we go into different modalities. Okay. And so when you hear phrases in the public, just in the pop culture, like stand your ground, stand your ground, that's not just a phrase. That's one of our operators. When we're in the face of stress, confrontation, we stand our ground sometimes, or we operate sort of in that forceful way. And I guarantee you, it's just like a dog, just like the dog naturally closes the ears back, just like the dog naturally gets the hair up, we also close our environmental ventilation windows. Okay, so we're not ventilating with the environment. We're now operating against the environment. And I would say, let's meditate as a society, as an agrarian, technological society. Have we not maybe inherited collectively, okay, a closing of the windows to nature, to wilderness? Okay, is it not possible that in our civilization is built on an enclosure, okay, that has closed the windows to really relate intimately with wilderness, okay? And that's important because if you look back at, let's say, primitive humans or early civilization, wilderness was a dangerous place. There could be bears, there could be snakes, or even if you're, like, say, some tribe in Africa, and you have, like, say, your campsite, where the tribe is living, you want to sort of define the enclosure as sort of like separate from the wilderness on the outside. Okay, so you sort of define the territory, the clearing of that enclosure. Okay, so even as tribal or as part of the community, as tribal beings or as part of the community of human beings, we collectively also have enclosure operations that is part of our survival. Okay, so let's be real careful. We're not just talking, when we talk about these enclosures of the ego, okay, we're not just talking about having a deficit in relating just to other people interpersonally. Okay, we can also have these closing of the ventilation, closing of the windows, where we're now insensitive, let's say, to wilderness, to nature. Okay, and some of us who are very highly expressed, as people who are very, let's say, technologically oriented or maybe very agriculturally oriented, we may have inherited very, very deep inherited sort of like operators, modalities that are instinctively, inherently insensitive to nature, insensitive to wilderness. Okay, so there's lots of different operators we've got. Okay, or even like the operator of, like, say, the leader, like I'm leading the pack, and even if I'm not leading other people, let's say if I'm really overwhelmed with all my job and all the stresses of life, it, there's a part of me that wants to stand up as the leader and just sort of like take care of everything. But what's really coming out of me is the leader, which will tend to sort of diminish other people and assume sort of the arrogant position. And it's all unconscious. I mean, these are things that we just inherit. Okay. But the thing is that some people have more dialectical integration, or how would you say? Some people have a more sophisticated dialectical process where when they get activated, they still maintain awareness outside of that activation. Okay, so let's say if I activate, let's say my militant leader, okay, I still retain simultaneously like other parts of me that are also aware at the time, and I don't just fall into one modality. Okay, but unfortunately, people who have limited dialectical processing, okay, when we get too activated in one thing, we sort of fall all the way into it, and the rest of us is kind of disappears. Okay, and that's where we lose the object relations and all that kind of stuff, and stable identity, why we don't have a stable identity. So here's the thing, there's no magic on this. There's no magic cure. Nobody knows really how to deal with this, but the best we can do is just learn and learn and learn to notice when we're getting activated. Okay, kind of learn to notice when the windows of our house, the house of our self, when the windows are open, to be ventilating with environmental content, meaning what's in our environment. Okay, and when the windows are closing. Okay, and so slowly, we sort of learn to notice as we're getting activated when our windows are closing and when we're not ventilating with the environment. Okay, and there's no magic, but as you learn to notice, you just unconsciously learn to sort of just be aware, and maybe slowly, slowly we can learn that as we're getting activated in certain modes, that we can sort of retain a sort of separate presence, a sort of separate awareness, so that we can try to sort of mechanically, artificially just kind of open the doors, open the windows, and not completely close the ventilation. Okay. And so in my case, what that has to do is with just kind of assuming the burden, the load, feeling loaded down physically, okay, with the burden of all the issues and considerations that are really in my environment, okay. And I have to really sort of mechanically make myself do that just to sort of reopen, the ventilation with the outside of myself, you know. And so we just learn to make that a way of practice. And it's kind of like we don't have, unfortunately, we don't have automatic transmission. We have to do manual transmission. Okay, so we do have to learn a few artificial steps, but that's a good practice to sort of, in the activation of life, in the stress, in the midst of the stress and the hustle and the bustle of life, or as we're getting overwhelmed, sometimes we will get activated, okay, and we'll notice the doors closing and the ears will go back, and so we have to sort of like gently, very gently, not challenging, not fighting, but just kind of gently sort of open a few windows and just sort of learn to also to be activated, but at the same time to have other aspects present, so we don't just fall into one modality, okay. And I think in that way we can sort of recover our persistent, our sense of a persistent self, and better object relations. Okay, so just an idea, but basically, so the idea here is that when we talk about the ego and we talk about sort of like what it means to have an activated ego state where we're really kind of separate from the environment, um, what we're really dealing with is not just a lack of empathy. Empathy is just one aspect. Okay, it's the interpersonal aspect of how we're starting to close our windows to ventilation with the outside world generally. Okay, so basically, for me, I would rather just not really focus so much on empathy specifically, but I'd rather focus more on the environment itself. Okay, and just notice how during different times of the day or different times of the month or the week or as the days go by, just notice when my ventilation is better or worse with the outside world, and to sort of make it part of my program as a way of life, as an adopted way of life, in my recovery. And by the way, a recovery can be nothing less than the adoption of a way of life. Okay, this is maybe why I have the instinct to sort of be a little bit suspicious of just therapy, because therapy is just what, twice a week, once a week. It's kind of like going to church. There's a difference between people who go to church and people who live and walk the walk. It's not just once a week. It's not just once in a while. It is life. It is the way of life. Okay, so to me, there is no recovery that isn't a way of life, because the personality disorder, that is your life. Okay, it dominates your life, and it doesn't take a vacation. So we have to adopt a way of life. Okay, so basically, in my way of life, you know, I'm watching the ventilation with the air of the outside, because if I don't watch that ventilation, okay, I can have places where I don't realize my windows are closing and I'm not trading air from the outside. Okay, the house, my in-house air and the outside air, it's not mixing. Okay, so you got to open the windows so that the outside air comes in and the inside air goes out, and that way what is myself sort of blends out into the environment, and the environment starts coming into me, start dissolving the ego that way. Okay, so basically we could look at, I talk a lot about environmental taxation, tax burden. But in order to have that burden, in order to have that taxation, you have to have ventilation. Ventilation is probably the best word. The windows are open and the air from the outside is ventilating in and the air from the inside is ventilating out. So let's think of it as, instead of reducing ourselves to that sort of subset where you're dealing just with interpersonal empathy, okay, why don't we broaden it out and let's talk about the real problem, which is environmental ventilation. Environmental ventilation. Okay. And really make that a meditation point. As soon as you have the concept of environmental ventilation, okay, then everybody, each of us can develop our own techniques, our own way of sort of understanding our own reality in that area. And we all become test pilots and we develop our own methods in our recovery. Okay. So anyway, yeah. So basically, I'm just struggling all the time to replace the common buzzwords for NPD, the common DSM symptoms, and look at the more broader categories of what's really, really happening. Okay, so The deficit in empathy is really just a tiny aspect or just a percentage of a larger problem, which is reduced environmental ventilation. Okay, because we get too caught up in certain modalities, certain militant operator modalities, okay, that by their nature like to close the window. Like the dog folds its ears back when it gets upset, and that's just, we're just dealing with our human endowment, okay, and we live with our human history, and part of the human history are these different modalities, okay. It's just that when you have cluster B, those modalities, they'll dominate too much, and they're not just one voice in the crowd, they over dominate and the rest of us kind of evaporates, okay. So the idea is that even especially when we're activated, we want to think of ways that we can sort of work on, sort of manual transmission, sort of reopening the windows to sort of recover the ventilation, the environmental ventilation. Okay, so um, basically, I want to sort of like kind of minimize the emphasis on empathy or lack of empathy, and I want to look more at environmental ventilation. Okay, and that's probably the best phrase that I can come with now. And then also understand that once we start ventilating, okay, are we just ventilating, or are we actually assuming the burden of all the environmental considerations that are now coming in? Okay, you can't, if the environmental considerations come in and we just sort of dispose of them quickly, we're not really suffering them. Okay, and I guess I could almost say like I'm the anti-Buddhist, because the Buddhist is like this discovery that human life is suffering, and how can we overcome suffering? Okay, whereas I'm like the reverse. I think in a funny way, at least for cluster B, if we assume some level of suffering, in the sense that we allow ourselves to be burdened and weighed down to a certain extent by our environmental considerations, okay, that paradoxically, if we assume a certain amount of suffering, being weighed down, weighed a little bit weighed down by the considerations in our environment, that low grade suffering will actually produce more benefit in our lives. And that's how you grow the oak tree. That's how you grow the big trees. You have to trade something for something. If you want big trees, you got to assume a little bit of a taxation. So yeah, open the windows, get the air coming in to the house, but assume the burden of it a little bit. Everybody find call it their therapeutic dosage, but nothing good comes with no pain, no pain, no gain, So I really think that it's almost like anti-Buddhist. You want to have a little bit of suffering, but really assume it, because that's where the heart gets activated to start metabolizing the burden. Okay. And when you have a burden to metabolize, you're opening up you're opening up like a richness that has been kind of dead or dormant, reawakening the heart. And we do that by assuming a certain amount of burden. You got to ventilate in order to be able to assume that. And then slowly our heart can come alive, and we can slowly be on the road to a recovery. So yeah, I just want to really reinforce, if we're going to have a new buzzword, I would say environmental ventilation, okay, as an avenue to be able to take on what comes in through the ventilation. Okay, so yeah, just want to again just sort of reduce, sort of like the misunderstanding that narcissism is specifically an interpersonal issue. It may show up interpersonally, but really it's a more global reduction, a limitation in our environmental ventilation. Okay, and we want to. I think it would be more helpful for us to focus just generally on how we integrate with the environment, and part of that is sort of finding ways to improve the environmental ventilation. So, anyway, thanks for watching, and best wishes to everybody. Talk to you later.